Hello, my name is Tyler Heston, pronouns he, him. I'm the minister to youth here at Country Club Christian Church. Thanks for joining me for this class that I'm calling Queer Christianity. For the next half hour or so, I'm going to invite you to learn and think about what it means to be LGBTQ plus in the church, what it means to be an inclusive faith community, and the gifts of queer spirituality for Christian faith. This is a fitting course to offer here at the end of Pride Month. A month in which people across the globe both celebrate LGBTQ plus identity and advocate for the continued work of building more inclusive societies. Before I dive in, I want to offer a little roadmap of where we'll be going in our time together today. First, I'm going to offer a brief conversation that defines some terms that are important in this conversation. Then I'm going to share a very brief history of LGBTQ folk in American Christianity in particular. I'm just pulling a few different events within American history that kind of set the scene for where we are today. Then I'll switch gears and share some tips for how communities like ours can practice wider inclusion for all people, especially LGBTQ folk. And then I'll finish with some thoughts about what queer spirituality means and what gifts it has for Christian faith. I want to note that today's course is by no means comprehensive. I just think that the things that I'll share today will be helpful for us as a church to think about who we are as a welcome and inclusive community, and hopefully spark some more conversation about what it means to welcome and celebrate LGBTQ people of faith. So let's start with defining some terms. First, I want to note that vocabulary around gender and sexuality can be confusing, especially for people who aren't familiar with the variety of ways in which people identify. And I want to note that's okay. You don't have to have this all understood. Language, the definition of these words, like language in general, is flexible. Language, culture, and our understanding of ourselves evolve and change throughout time. So it's not important to know every single definition perfectly. It matters instead that we're willing to listen, hear, and come to new understandings of who people are and how they navigate themselves and their world. Second, it's important to know that there are two different dynamics at play in the conversation around LGBTQ people: sexual orientation and gender identity. When we talk about LGBTQ folk, we talk about people with non-normative identities in either of these two fields: non-normative sexual orientations or non-normative gender identities. It's important to know that sexual orientation is not the same thing as gender identity. So when we talk about sexual orientation, we're talking about people to whom one is attracted to, physically and or romantically, and the two may be separate. And when we talk about gender identity, we talk about someone's psychological sense of self and how it aligns or does not align with constructions of gender in society. It's important to know that for various reasons, whether it's safety, comfort, or something else, people may not fully express their gender identity. So how they know themselves to be on the inside may not be fully reflected on their external lives because of something outside of them. So it's important to be open and not to focus and function on assumptions in this world. So I don't have time to dive too much deeper into this conversation about like sexual orientation versus gender identity, which can be a huge one. But I recommend visiting this website if you're curious for learning more, genderbread.org. I pulled this image from their website. They do a great job of really explaining the difference between sex and gender and sexual orientation, and really building a framework for how we can understand the variety of layers that go into who we are as people. So, as you already probably know, we have a bit of an alphabet soup when it comes to talking about LGBTQ plus people. There are a variety of ways in which people formulate this acronym, different letters, sometimes with or without a plus sign at the end. The two versions I use most often are LGBTQ plus and LGBTQIA plus. I find that both of those are super expansive, have a lot of room, and they seem to be the most common in the circles that I run around in. So here are what those letters mean. Different people will use different acronyms, and there's no one right acronym. But the first letter is L, which stands for lesbian and refers to a woman who is attracted to people of the same gender. Similarly, G stands for gay, which refers to men or a man who is attracted to people of the same gender. B stands for bisexual, which refers to someone who is attracted to both their gender and people of other genders. Here in a minute, we'll see how gender is more expansive than a binary thing. It's more expansive than man and woman. So while a lot of people hear bisexual and think it refers to people who are attracted to both men and women, a lot of us define it now as someone who's attracted to both their gender and people of other genders, so that can include people who are attracted to people who don't fit into the gender binary. Which brings us to T, which stands for transgender. Transgender is somewhat an umbrella term itself, and it refers to anyone without a cisgender identity. So someone who is cisgender is someone who identifies with their gender assigned at birth or their physical sex. The word cis, C-I-S, comes from the Latin word on this side of, while trans comes from the Latin word on the other side of. So people who are cisgender or non-transgender people who identify with their sex assigned at birth, like me, I'm a cisgender man, or some people say cis, I'm a cis man. So transgender folk include a variety of people. They include transgender men and transgender women, or men or women of trans experience. I hear that a lot now. So those are people who may have been born labeled one gender, but have come out as trans, that have transitioned or are in the process of transitioning to who they understand themselves to be on the inside. Transgender also includes people who are gender queer or are non-binary, which these are people who fall outside of, identify outside of the gender binary. And we see that it's not a simple choice of man or woman, but something much more expansive. We see a lot more people use now the pronouns they, them, or other alternative pronouns instead of he, him, or she, her, to help them name and live into their genderqueer or non-binary identity. They may understand themselves as somewhere in between man and woman or somewhere outside of that binary. But trans people includes all of this. Someone does not have to pass as a conventional man or woman to be trans. There are plenty of people who are truly themselves in these third spaces outside of the category of man and woman. Because we never know how someone identifies, it's helpful to include our own pronouns, like I did at the beginning of this class when we introduce ourselves, so that people feel more comfortable to be their authentic selves. So the next letter that often gets used in these acronyms is Q, which stands for Q, which stands for queer, or sometimes questioning. So Q represents people who don't strictly identify with one of the aforementioned categories, but still experience an alternative or marginalized version of sexual orientation or gender identity. So I'll get to more on the word queer in a moment. But there are two more letters before I want to get there, and those are I, which stands for intersex, and A, which stands for asexual. So intersex refers to people born with biological or anatomical sex that doesn't fit into the category of male or female. So this may be a chromosomal distinction or a distinction in one's genitalia, but some studies actually suggest that 1 out of every 100 people are born with some sort of intersex characteristic, even if it's subtle and minor. There's a huge variety of intersex experience that reminds us that there is no clear binary between male and female, but it's something much more varied and expansive. If you Google BuzzFeed intersex, BuzzFeed did an excellent series of videos in which they interviewed intersex people of a variety of different experiences. That was huge for me in like getting to know what it meant to be intersex, because this is a group of people that are often left out of the queer conversation and queer community. Similarly, asexual, though it represents another group that's often left out of even queer circles. And asexual people are people who experience little or no sexual attraction. Some people identify as asexual and they experience no sexual or romantic attraction at all. Others may experience romantic attraction, but no sexual attraction, or they may be somewhere in between. But I think it's important to name this experience as well because it's queer, it's different, it's non-normative, and a lot of asexual people really do feel unseen because of who they are. And then finally, we often include a plus sign at the end as a signal that there are more identities that people are still coming to understand and express. So this is a lot of letters, and it can be confusing. I think labels can be limiting and they can also be liberating. So it's important that we have all these names because some people may hear gay and lesbian and not see themselves in that, but may understand themselves as intersex or queer or bisexual and be liberated and to be who they are because of that term. But it can also be limiting. So I want to move on to one more word before we talk about a brief history, and that's the word queer. So the word queer technically means strange, odd, or something that's not normal. Over 100 years ago, the word queer became a pejorative term used against LGBTQ plus people. But in the 80s, as LGBTQ communities became more organized, as more LGBTQ folk were accepted and affirmed in society, people began to reclaim the word intentionally. When it really started to take hold in the turn of the millennium. It's become a sort of umbrella term now for the variety of non-normative experiences and identities in regards to gender and sexual orientation. But there are still many people who do have a negative reaction to the word. So it's something about which we have to be careful and sensitive. To become a norm, though, especially in younger communities and within academia, people love it because it's open and flexible. It's not as tricky as alphabet soup. The word queer has more space for people who don't fit neatly into a single category. Like the person who understood themselves as straight until their spouse came out as transgender, and then suddenly they were in a queer relationship. Also, the word queer is intentionally provocative. It's a reminder that society is not built to contain alternative approaches to romance and relationships and marriage and family. To be queer is to challenge the norms and status quo. And I think queer identity invites everyone to reconsider how we can live in such a way that people can be who they truly are and love who they love. And so even though I fit neatly into the category of gay, I really prefer the word queer because of the ways in which my experience as a gay man has led me into a different way of living and navigating society, trying to be more fully inclusive. But I do use the word queer and LGBTQ plus, sometimes with or without the plus, and you'll hear me use them interchangeably today. So let's move on to a brief history of LGBTQ Americans, particularly within Christianity. I'm pulling just a few dates and a few events out to set the scene. If you want the full story, we can go all the way back to the ancient West and look at the prevalence of homoerotic and celebrated relationships in ancient Greece and Rome. And we can even show how there is some evidence of what might be considered same-sex marriages in the ancient church. I'm going to start more recently in the 1950s, just so we can see how resistant the dominant narrative in our country has been to LGBTQ plus people. So if we go back just 68 years to 1952, that's when the American Psychiatric Association decided to include homosexuality under the sociopathic personality disturbance category in its first official list of mental disorders. No problem, it was moved to sexual deviation in 1968. So we can see with that how at that time, and this lasted through the 50s and 60s, there were LGBTQ plus people. There have always been LGBTQ plus people. But especially in the 50s and 60s, these people lived in the shadows. LGBTQ communities were only in the shadows, slowly growing and becoming more public, but really repressed in general society. So there was a landslide moment in 1969 in Greenwich Village, New York City, where there was a popular gay bar named Stonewall Inn. Stonewall, like gay bars across the country, were regularly raided by police. There were laws across the country prohibiting homosexual activity. So police could arrest two men for simply kissing or arrest someone for being transgender and being visible. So places like Stonewall Inn were both some of the only safe spaces for LGBTQ people, but they were also hotbeds for police brutality. On June 28, 1969, almost 51 years ago to the day, police raided Stonewall, and this time its patrons decided that enough was enough. So police, like in many raids, were rough and violent as they were making arrests. But this time, the people who weren't arrested because they happened to not be kissing someone in that moment or for whatever other reason, didn't flee like they normally did. This time they stuck around. After one woman was hit by a police officer, the crowd began resisting, and it turned into uprisings and riots. These uprisings lasted for days and really quickened the energy around organizing and advocating for more rights for LGBTQ plus people. Activist organizations were formed in New York City and beyond. In the following year, on June 28, 1970, the first gay pride marches took place in New York, LA, and San Francisco. So this is the root of what Pride Month is. The big corporate festivals that we have now, which are all happy and feel safe and they're good, started out because a crowd was willing to stand up to injustice and police brutality. Many of the leaders of the Stonewall Uprising in 1969 were trans women of color, like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha P. Johnson's the woman on the left in this photo that you see now. So Pride 2020 has been a harrowing reminder about how much I, as a white gay man, have to thank the bold resistance of queer women of color for the freedoms and rights I have today. It's been really important to me that we reshape the history, because I think Pride has become dominated by people who look like me, when it was a total, like even more oppressed people who fought for my rights before I was even born. So 1969, 1970 was a huge moment in America and the world for LGBTQ plus rights. Around then is when we started to see more inclusion in American churches. So in 1970, the Unitarian Universalist Association became the first U.S. mainstream religious group to recognize lesbian, gay, and bisexual clergy and laity within its ranks, and to demand an end to anti-gay discrimination. Unfortunately, the same year, the Vatican issued a statement reiterating that homosexuality is a moral aberration. 2 years later, the United Church of Christ, the sister denomination with whom we partner a lot as disciples, ordains their first openly gay minister. And it was just a few years later that we as disciples began to shift and open to the idea of inclusion for LGBTQ plus people. A landmark moment happened in 1977 when at our denomination's General Assembly, a resolution opposing homosexuality and the ordination of LGBTQ plus folk was proposed and defeated. There was a moving letter read by a woman named Carol Blakely, just a church member in Caldwell, Idaho, that was her son's coming out letter. That letter was read was a moment in which so many across our denomination realized and kind of internalized the dire need to rethink our inclusion of LGBTQ people in the denomination. 2 years later, in 1979, at the next General Assembly, there was a private meeting of LGBTQ people that's considered to be the first unofficial meeting of what's now known as the Disciples LGBTQ Plus Alliance, or Alliance Q, which is the organization that works for LGBTQ plus inclusion across our denomination. I serve on the council, I have for almost 4 years now, so you may have heard me talk about the Alliance Q sometimes. So those two were the seed beds for the inclusion in our denomination, and inclusion and affirmation continue to slowly grow. Just a couple years later, there were two women who became the first openly LGBTQ ordained disciples ministers. And later in the 80s, in 1986, a church in Seattle became the first open and affirming church in the denomination, officially open and affirming. It was the next year that the Alliance was officially incorporated. Then we were GLAD Alliance, or the Gay and Lesbian Alliance of Disciples. The first local chapter of GLAD was actually organized the same year here in Kansas City. So there was a lot of movement in the 80s that really was forming the institution of us being an inclusive denomination. It's cool to know how much of the history was here in Kansas City. One of the earliest photos from Alliance history that I could find was a photo of the GLAD event at Tall Oaks here in KC, when 40 people gathered for a retreat together, learning together to do community together in this new thing of being queer and Christian, and to talk together about how to advocate for themselves in our denomination when they were still really resistant to lesbian and gay and other queer people. So throughout the rest of the 80s and the 90s, it was steady growth of welcome and recognition of LGBTQ people in the denomination, with plenty of resistance and struggle from churches, from leaders, and even general ministers and presidents. But by 2000, there was real momentum, and in the past 20 years, we've grown in our reputation of being an inclusive denomination. It's powerful to hear about how 30 years ago, there was so much resistance to the Alliance at General Assembly, because now the Alliance booth is the most popular booth at the expo room at General Assembly. There are hundreds of churches that are recognized as open and affirming, and many of our denominational organizations and ministries are open and affirming too. So there's still work to be done. Just in 2017, the GLAAD Alliance renamed itself into the Disciples LGBTQ+ Alliance, as part of this difficult recognition of how much work there is left to do, especially for transgender folk and LGBTQ people of color. What motivated our name change is realizing that the GLAAD Alliance made us sound like we only cared about gay and lesbian folk and not everyone else who was queer. And it was also a way for us to name that we have been really good at advocating for white gays and lesbians in the denomination, but not other people, especially trans folk and especially queer people of color. But it's been cool. I feel like there's a real quickening in the work of the Alliance now to expand this inclusion. Just next week, we're hosting a virtual Pride worship service that we're calling Riot, Turning Over Tables, in which we'll center the roots of pride in the resistance of trans women of color. We're centering voices and prayers and proclamations from leaders of color and trans folk in our denomination. And our general minister and president is going to be a part of this. So it's huge. We're at a huge moment in who we are as a denomination as we really challenge ourselves to follow Christ and including all people. And I'm really excited about the future. So there is so much more history we could go through. And I would love to have conversations with anyone who wants to talk more about this stuff. But let's move on now to talk about a few tips for practicing wider inclusion as a faith community. So my first tip is that we must continue educating ourselves. There are so many books and movies and resources for learning about what LGBTQ identity looks like, what queer history is in our world. There are movies and TV shows like Paris is Burning and Pose. There are plenty of books and articles that we can read about LGBTQ+ people and their experiences. But I think it's particularly important for us as Christians to learn more about LGBTQ folk within Christianity. I named a couple books on the screen that you might read. One is Does Jesus Really Love Me by Jeff Chu. Jeff Chu is a journalist turned seminarian, or maybe a minister now. And in this book, he collects stories of like 15 different LGBTQ Christians that he interviewed across America, each who has so many different experiences. And it's this beautiful collection of stories of people really struggling to understand God's love for them in a world that told them they're unlovable. And then Rainbow Theology by Patrick S. Chang is more academic theology, but does a great job of talking about what it means to be both queer and a person of color in a Christian faith. So, too, it's important to know stories and history and this and that, but even more narrowly, it's important that Christians know how to deconstruct arguments against LGBTQ+ Christians. It's important that good allies know how to explain to their friends who don't think you can be gay and Christian, queer and Christian. It's important that we know how to argue against that, to deconstruct that argument. We can't always change people's minds with arguments, but to have that conversation. So a couple books I recommend for learning more about how to defend gay Christians and queer Christians include God and the Gay Christian by Matthew Vines. He's actually a young Christian leader from Kansas City. And that book was his work was some of the most important when I was coming out myself. And then Bible, Gender, and Sexuality by James Brownson does an excellent job of demonstrating how it's improper to argue that Christianity is resistant to LGBTQ people and identity. So yeah, continue educating. Second tip is to talk about our welcome. It's important that we celebrate that our church welcomes and celebrates LGBTQ+ people. We should be proud of that. It's a huge, beautiful thing. It's important that when we talk about our church, we name this from conversations and with friends and in our official commitments like identity statements and mission statements. It's important that we name that we are a place in which all people are welcome, regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity, because so many people don't know that churches like us exist. I lost track my first few months here in Kansas City, in which I met people and told them I was gay and a minister, and they were like, "What? How is that possible?" So many people simply don't know that Christianity like ours exists, and it's important that we talk about it. As we talk about it and celebrate our welcome, it's important that we continue growing in our sensitivity and how we talk about and with LGBTQ people. So my third tip is that we have to avoid microaggressions. We have to watch out for microaggressions. So a microaggression is an everyday slight, indignity, put down, or insult that people of color, women, LGBTQ plus population, and others who are marginalized experience in their day-to-day interactions with people. So microaggression is a small comment or small action that may even be well-meaning, may not hurt by itself, but remind marginalized people of their marginalization. And one microaggression, most of us queer people know how to handle it, but when they add on to each other, they can become so exhausting. So microaggressions include comments like, "You're not like other gay people I've met," or "Yeah, you're different than other gay people." Or the comment, "Oh, you're trans, I would have never known." Other microaggressions include assuming that all LGBTQ plus people know each other, or even more narrowly, assuming that your gay friend wants to date your other gay friend. I've met so many people who are like, "Oh, you're so cool, and you're gay. I have another gay friend. Y'all should date." It's like, I don't tell every straight woman I meet that she should date all of my straight men friends. It's not how it works. A similar sort of microaggression is bringing every question or thought that you have regarding LGBTQ plus issues to one LGBTQ plus friend. I've had people in my life who are like this before. Every time they think of something related to LGBTQ plus issues, they have to bring it to me. We never really have conversations about anything else. So I love talking about LGBTQ action or activism and advocacy and what it means to be queer. But when that's all you ever talk to me about, I'm going to start thinking that you don't see me as anything but a gay person. And so that's another microaggression. Microaggressions include misgendering someone and not stopping someone else when they misgender someone. So all of my friends who are trans, whether they're trans men, trans women, or genderqueer, are really open and if you misgender them and correct yourself, they're like, "Hey, don't worry about it." I misgender people all the time, regardless of their whether or not they're trans. But as soon as we do it and don't stop ourselves or act like, "Oh, I made a huge mistake," we just have to be cool with it. Yeah, and similarly, using phrases that imply a gender binary can be a microaggression. So saying things like boys and girls or ladies and gentlemen, which are so ingrained in our society and really hard to rethink, they leave out space for people who aren't who don't fit into the gender binary, genderqueer folk, other trans people. So it's important that even in our small little language like this, we seek to be more inclusive. Yeah. And then finally, just using stereotypes to make assumptions about who LGBTQ plus people are. There are things like gay people love to joke about the things we have in common with other gay people. But the reality is none of us are the same. There's no one way to be LGBTQ plus. And so when you function with stereotypes, you remind people that they're different and that there's more work to be done so that they can be included. And even if it's coming from a good place, it can be just damaging and hurtful to queer people to constantly be realized, triggered, "Oh yeah, you're the world isn't ready for you yet." So it's important to watch out for these little things. Intent does not equal outcome. We can be very well intended and still hurt people's feelings with the thing we say. So as we celebrate our welcome, it's important that we seek to be continuously more sensitive. So this connects to the fourth tip I have, which is to implement small and proactive practices in our life to be a more inclusive culture here at our church and everywhere else. So a simple way to do this is to include our pronouns when we introduce ourselves. Name tags are a great place to do that. Your email signature is a great place to do that. Like I did at the beginning of this. I'm just kind of normalizing more. "Hi, my name is Tyler. My pronouns are he, him." Can create such a different culture for people who have non-normative gender identities to claim and name who they are. Similar, it's important that we designate certain bathrooms to be gender inclusive. We have some non-gender bathrooms here that are safe spaces for people to go to and not have to worry, are people going to judge me for using the bathroom I'm supposed to use? Third, I think it's important that we center LGBTQ plus individuals and families when we have the chance. We do this as a church. We don't hide that we have queer people. We center them when we can. And I think it's important that we do this in all areas of life, that when we're looking for people to serve as an example or to speak, we seek to center people who are marginalized regarding gender and sexuality, or so many other ways too. And similarly, it's important to continue asking, how would LGBTQ folk see this? Because I think we do so much in our lives and we forget the LGBTQ. Yeah, I do it the same thing. The LGBTQ people won't see themselves in that. So a narrow way in which I think this is important is it's important that we don't have the assumption that everyone is on the same trajectory of marriage and family. I think it's important that as a culture in general, if we want to be a better place for queer people, we don't treat it as like the norm is to get married, have 2.5 kids with a white picket fence and a dog named Spot, and that you're consciously choosing something else if you do something else. But rather, we create a culture in which there is no norm, so that more conventional forms of marriage and family are people's choices, and people can choose to be who they want to be. It can be another microaggression to assume that every gay person wants to do the same, like wants to have a spouse and kids just like they would if they were a conventional straight person. Because a lot of queer people want something so different. So it's important that we kind of rethink how we approach society so that we can recreate or create a better space for LGBTQ plus people. Whew. So my last tip for being a more inclusive faith community is to get involved with the Disciples LGBTQ plus Alliance. I'm going to plug the Alliance. So you can visit us online at the disciplesallianceq.org to find out more of who we are and what we're doing, all the different work we do to promote inclusivity across our denomination. You can become a donating member to support our work. We have a full-time executive director, and most of our budget goes to pay her to not travel right now as much, but to travel, do church trainings, get to know churches who are in the process of becoming open and affirming, speak and do her work. We provide resources for churches who are becoming ONA, who already are and seeking to live out that welcome. So our membership is really important. We offer building and inclusive church trainings throughout the year. We actually hosted one here at Country Club, I want to say last November. Those are on pause right now with COVID, but we hope to keep those going soon. There's usually one in each region every year or two. And finally, I think it's important that we learn more what it means to be a registered, open, and affirming church. Even though Country Club has a reputation for being welcoming and inclusive to LGBTQ people, I met so many gay people right after I moved this city who told me they had been to a gay wedding at this church before. We are not technically open and affirming on the official list for our denomination because there's certain procedures that we have to do that. So it's important that we know what that means and what that looks like to see if that's something we want to do as a church. And finally, we have so many resources on our church website, resources for education, resources for being an inclusive church, and so much more. So you can visit disciplesallianceq.org/resources to learn more. So finally, I want to share a few thoughts about what queer spirituality can offer Christianity. For so long, LGBTQ plus people have had to defend themselves when they only stayed on the defense when they're talking about their faith and religious identity. So I want to share a few positive, offensive things that queer people can celebrate in their relationship to Christianity. So first and this will be brief, not comprehensive, just some nuggets to chew on as you think about what it means to be LGBTQ plus in the church or what it means for other people to be. So first, the conversation a lot of people have when they talk about LGBTQ plus people and Christian theology has to do with whether or not Jesus was gay. So honestly, I don't think that you can say clearly that Jesus was gay, mainly because the word gay implies something about contemporary understandings of sex, marriage, and love that just don't apply to the world Jesus lived in. Things were so different in how they understood marriage and sex and relationships that the word gay is it doesn't fit in. It's an anachronism for Jesus' time. However, I do think, and a lot of people do, talk about Jesus as queer, at least in a broad sense. Jesus rejected the norms of gender and sexuality for his day and preferred an alternative understanding of how God's love is to be embodied in oneself and one's community. Jesus talked about family as something more flesh and blood. I think he argued for chosen family. In Mark 3, he says, "Who are my mother and brothers? Whoever does the will of God is my mother and brother and sister." Throughout the Gospels, Jesus does something different than what he's expected to do in terms of his identity as a man, and in how he navigates sexuality and family. And in my opinion, he's very queer in how he does that. He also promoted a queer alternative way to how society worked in a similar way that queer people now try to build an alternative way of doing life. Jesus spent his life with sinners and outcasts, people like LGBTQ people who have been outcasted in modern society, and he fought for their place and stood up for their value. So I know when I came to terms with myself as a gay person, I learned to see myself in the Gospels in a new way, because every time it talked about Jesus like being there for the outcast, I realized like, oh, that's how Jesus is there for me. So I don't think Jesus was gay, not at least in a narrow way. There's some interesting studies about that stuff. But I do think that Jesus was queer. He modeled an alternative way of doing gender identity and navigating a sexual world that was queer. It was different, and that's very liberating for us current queer folk. So second, I think queer spirituality has something great to offer in terms of how it emphasizes the embodiedness of God. I think that queer spirituality helps Christianity remember that faith is about who more than about what. When I came out, I realized how much I was learning about God because I was learning to more clearly love myself and love others. And I'm going to borrow from a book that you see on your screen in my hands for this part. In the book, Peculiar Faith, Queer Theology for Christian Witness, J. Emerson Johnson says that religious transformation begins after apologetic argument ends. Religious transformation is not something we convince people in our heads. It's something about our hearts and our bodies and our full lives. He goes on to talk about the weird place contemporary Christianity finds itself now in our country. He says institutional Christianity lives rather precariously with the traces of modernity's influence on its religious identity. Churches paid a price to retain a sense of relevance in the midst of scientific and socio-political advances, and equally so when they sought to fend off cultural encroachments. The ongoing anxiety over the decline of mainline Protestantism, underway since at least the 70s, serves as just one symptom of modern Christianity's malaise. Decline, however, does not signal impending death, or rather what has died within Western Christianity has sparked in phoenix-like fashion some signs of rebirth. So he goes on to talk about the weird, or the way in which there's a sort of divide in contemporary American Christianity between progressive mainline Protestants like us, who understand social transformation, and the more evangelical and fundamental Christians who censor personal, devotional, spiritual practice. He talks about how this breach widens more and more each year, but queer Christians, many of whom come from evangelical traditions and find themselves in mainline traditions like me, can offer renewal and combine these two elements. He says that a queer theology for Christian witness can lend compelling assistance for that renewal, for all those eager to live as repairers of the breach, as Isaiah might say in New Ways Today. So second, I think queer spirituality helps us learn that God is something we embody, both in how we affect the societal transformation around us and how we experience God's love in our own lives and own internal experience. It shows us that Christianity is not a game of good answers, but it's asking new questions about lived realities and finding God's love in that. So third, and this kind of ties to some of what I just said, I think queer spirituality has an authority on recreation. Queer spirituality knows how to recreate itself. Like J. Emerson Johnson said, queer spirituality is important for the future of the church. It's kind of like a phoenix rising out of the ashes. But even more generally, though, 2020 has been hard in regards to how we've called into question societal structures. And I've had so much of our normalcy stripped away. Especially in March and April, I thought a lot about how this is not a new experience for many queer people. For many people, coming out and embracing oneself as queer means rethinking every way in which they navigate society. I know that was true for me. When I came out, I felt like my whole world was being taken apart and taken away from me, much like many of us felt when the lockdown started this year. So COVID-19 has made us rethink society, and the uprisings over the past month have shown us other ways in which our society is not working and needs to change. And LGBTQ people, queer people, we have a certain authority because we know we've had to rethink ourselves. I really think our voice is important as we as a society talk about the ways in which we can rethink how we do what we do so that it works for all people. There's a lot of fear in our country right now about what are we going to do moving forward. And one of the things I really sense is that queer people within Christianity and elsewhere are going to step into their authority and their queer wisdom and learning how to recreate ourselves from scratch into something more authentic, something more true, and something more whole, both in an individual and a collective sense. So I could blab on for hours about all of this, but we are at the end of this Queer Christianity, a primer on LGBTQ folk in the church. Please reach out to me either via email or some other way. My email is tylerh@ccccKC.org. If you would like to continue this conversation or have any more questions, both whether it's personal, ideological questions, or more conversations about what it means to be an inclusive faith community. Again, I recommend checking out any of the books I listed. You can go back through this presentation and find those, or check out the disciplesallianceq.org website for more resources. I'm so grateful to be a part of a church community in which we all don't look and think the same, and to feel truly celebrated and affirmed for who I am as a queer person. And I'm so excited for our future as we learn to lean more into Christ's welcome of all people. Thank you.